sunny 82 degrees. I'm feeling inadequate, and this is Heavy Board.
And I'm Andrew Wittstadt. Welcome. Welcome. It's funny, dude. Right before we started this, since we had time, since we started later than we normally do, or like that we wanted to, shit happens. And so I had like an extra hour that I was just like unplanned because I was like, all right, I finished my other shit that I was trying to do today. And then I just picked up that Pauline Kael book again and just started like reading a couple more reviews from like 1960s. And it was like, damn, dude, I just read her Bonnie and Clyde review. I mean, there's a reason that she's so beloved by everybody because, I mean, this is just, like, nobody else is writing like that. Like, nobody has written like she did since. Like, very few people are just writing with that energy, that passion. Just like, you can feel the pleasure, like the sheer, like, joy coming through the page. Like, you can just feel how into it she was.
Bitch loves movies.
Yeah, like not just that she loves movies, but she takes them very seriously, like
I know nothing about her. I
I
have
mean,
never heard of her until you started sending me quotes because and I should probably say I am no kind of movie buff. I haven't seen most of the great movies, and I personally like to watch just heaping piles of garbage
well,
all day.
well, me neither, man. I mean, we're part of Heavy Board is the fact of how underread we are. Like the only reason I picked up this book like months ago, cheaply. I think it's her first. It's Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. I think it's her first collection of like actual like essays, like an actual collection that was published, and it sat on my shelf for months, dude. But like everybody that I listened to, every podcast, every like movie person that was like into movies, like talked about Pauline Kael. Like even the people that hated her, like had to address. You have to address Pauline Kael because. And I was like, all right, well, let's see what this is all about. And dude, within the first couple pages, I was sending you quotes. Like, it's just by sheer dumb chance that like I started reading that book like this week, like just randomly like picked it up off my stack of unread shit and was like, oh, I'm gonna read this week, and it was like, damn, it just correlated. It helped my understanding, I think, of like Bloom in some sense, at least what Bloom's trying to do. And
I mean, that seems for sure.
yeah,
Like it feels sort of aligned. I mean, and we can like
we're gonna get to what
read
we
into
actually
that
plan
all we
to.
want. I don't know enough about her or even like Bloom's relationship to movies. I mean, he's just so deeply, deeply read, you know, starting, I'm sure, with the Torah while he was like, you know, getting schooled by his, I don't know, what do you call him? Should I say schuled? He was getting schuled.
I mean, you're the Jewish one, dude. I don't know. I don't know
I
any of
don't know.
this.
I don't fucking know. I only read the beginning of his biography. I guess you'd call it his biography.
I was raised Catholic, so I don't know anything about that shit, dude.
Yeah, I was raised, you know,
American
nothing.
American Jewish, yeah.
Reformed. We're Reformed
Reformed,
Jewish,
yeah. It's just like, I mean, that's
which,
how I was. It was like, yeah, it was like,
means we don't go to synagogue.
well, that's what yeah, like they call it Christmas and Easter Catholic, like how I was raised. It was like, yeah, we didn't go to church every Sunday, but like on Christmas and Easter we go to church, and like my mom would like invoke the teachings of God to like make us better people or whatever when we were kids, and like love thy neighbor type shit. Anyway,
Yeah.
let's get to what we actually wanted to talk about this week. So this week we did The Art of Reading Poetry by Harold Bloom, uh, the introductory essay for his collection of the best poems of the English language. It's nice that they publish The Art of Reading Poetry in like a separate little, paperback, and that's what Sophie and I bought, even though we both own the his big tome of the best poems of the English language. I'm not sure why we got separate versions, but this is what we did. It's
It's nice to have, dude, and you gotta have the little guy to carry around,
that,
you know?
yeah, it's
It's
much
so much
easier.
easier than lugging around that fucking big ass book.
That and like, book people will understand this. When you want to have multiple copies, you want to have a copy that you can mark up and then a copy that you treat like respectfully, like the paperbacks are nice for marking up and like you have to putting tape on the binding when like your shit's falling apart, but like, a nice hardcover, you don't really want to write in that. I'll be like, oh, put that on the shelf and let that be like a nice little display.
It becomes embarrassing when you try to share your books with people, you
Oh, dude,
know?
I don't share anything with people.
My sister keeps like buying books and I keep being like, "Oh, I have that. I could have given it to you." And then realizing it's just marked up to shit and just all fucking bent out of shape and I'm like, "God, no one can read this. My
Yeah.
underlining is egregious and embarrassing
That's what I
and
was thinking.
overmuch."
I was thinking next time that Norton puts out like a reprint. I guess the most recent one. What was the most recent one they did of the? Uh, I'm thinking of like the poetry anthology that Norton puts out. So the modern and contemporary ones. So like the 20th century poetry. That yeah,
This guy,
yeah. That's 2 volumes. I have both
I know.
volumes
I only
for.
have contemporary. I only have yeah, I have volume 2 that we got for the same fucking class in
And that was
college.
undergrad, and then in graduate school I needed both because we did use the volume 2 and 1
I
in
didn't because we didn't read poetry in grad school.
yeah. Yeah, there's plenty of
My writing
fun.
classes didn't read, so that was cool.
But I was thinking next time they come out with like an updated version, I think that what's the most recent was a 2003. I guess don't quote me on that because I don't know, but I think like
That's a good
2000,
idea.
yeah, like 2003 or so is the last time they put like an updated edition of that. And I think I might buy the next updated one just because my shitty notes from like my undergrad study when I was like a moron, I like poetry, like I just don't want to look at those ever again. So I'll just
It's embarrassing, you know.
yeah. So they'll have a marked up version and then like a clean
I still
version.
have them all though, but I do
Same,
have
yeah.
separate copies of like Sabrina Ora Mark's Sim I have a separate copy of
Dude, we
Bridget
should.
P. Kelly's The Orchard
Oh,
too.
dude, we should do Kelly's The Orchard on an
It's a
episode,
great
dude.
book.
Yeah, I mean,
God, she died not long ago
I
too.
know. So did Bloom, dude. I mean, right before the pandemic here,
Yeah, but she
Bloom.
was young. Like I mean,
Yeah,
she
that's
was
true.
younger.
Much, much
She was
younger.
like 60, 61, wasn't
I
she?
was gonna say, I think she was like even younger than that.
Yeah. So
Like,
that was a bummer. Was looking forward to that book. I mean, like whatever she was eventually going to put out next, but she historically takes a long time to write.
yeah, and she was another one that was just so serious, just so
So
serious.
original.
Yeah,
Just so starkly fucking original. It was insane and it would just eat away at your soul.
right. Like I think if people, I mean, that inspired me. Like, I mean, my first book isn't out yet. I mean, I've been hawking it to fucking presses and contests and shit, but it's the way. I mean, that inspired me deeply. I think reading that book, even years later, I still think of the sheep stands dumb by the fence. The sheep stands dumb. Like, and I just,
It's
just
great.
yeah, I think of that over and over again. Like, it just pops into my head randomly, and I'm just like, oh,
Sheep
what?
Child. Great
Yeah,
poem.
yeah. And I'm just like,
Go read it.
whoa.
Yeah, the whole book is fucking phenomenal.
Heavily influenced my collection that I've been trying to hawk here, but I hope to be my first book. All right, well, let's talk about the actual. I guess why people, if anybody actually came to listen to this, what they would listen for. Bloom. I'm just gonna read a brief off his Wikipedia because it's less convoluted.
Yeah.
So Harold Bloom was he was born on July 11th, 1930, and he died again recently, October 14th, 2019. It was. I remember it was a sad day when that happened, dude. I mean, I remember social media, especially, kind of going. Well, everybody's mixed just because he was such like a famous critic. So if you're that big, I mean, you're going to have a lot of hate and a lot of love at the same time. But so people were throwing that around. But I think most of what I saw when he died was positive. Like people, as most cases when people die, like it's all positive. Nobody's going to talk about the ugly shit, or
Well, yeah, I mean,
some
he
people will,
was
but yeah.
my sister, you know, I don't remember how it came up, but I like asked her something about Harold Bloom and about him being controversial, and she was kind of like, "Well, isn't he controversial?" And I was like, "Is he?" And then I discovered why. I mean, I get it.
Anybody,
Whatever.
anybody who has opinions is going to be controversial. So anybody that has a deep set opinion and argues that opinion
And like he
fiercely.
leads, I mean, well, he also does. Nonetheless, it is really difficult. I think you would be hard pressed to deny his intellect.
Yeah, but
Dude
anyway,
was fucking smart.
like I said, when he died, I think there were some few outliers. They were like, "Oh fuck Harold Bloom," I'm glad he's dead. Like I mean, with the internet and social media, everybody can say whatever they want. So of course, there's going to be people saying that. But I think for the most part, especially the serious literary stuff that you and I pay attention to, like I saw mostly good. Like people were like appreciated that this guy, and you'll hear me and Sophie talk about it too as we get into this. Like this fucking what Bloom, he was so serious, and so fucking ugly,
But
dude.
what
I'm
he
looking at his
had the
picture.
right to be,
Yeah,
right? He
yeah.
like had earned the right. Like I hate it when someone talks really seriously about poetry, but they're saying actual bullshit.
Oh, I mean, if we're gonna get into
Like
that,
I
dude, I mean
just
that's most
want it to
scholarship.
be this easy. A poem needs to be a pile of dirt, you know?
Well, I have a
It's
few
beautiful.
questions I
It's
want to
fucking
ask
beautiful.
you. Hopefully, by the time we get to the end of this essay, I wanted to ask you like some follow up stuff, and I think that'd be a good place to bring in that stuff about Kale and maybe some of the Wendler stuff to compare if we wanted to, or like I wanted to bring in Auden because since you and I are both Auden fans,
Yeah.
like Auden's ideas of poetry conflict with Bloom's, I think, to some, and he never really talks about Auden. I think Bloom's relatively dismissive of Auden, although I haven't read a lot of stuff about what he's written on him. But yeah, I think that could be interesting.
I
Anyway,
would
let's
have to even
what?
like I would have to go back to um fuck. I'd have to go back to I didn't even think to look at Auden. I thought about
Well,
pulling selected down.
nothing. I'm not going to be getting into anything specific about it, but I just wrote down in the notes here just about how his idea of like what is poetry does, as Bloom tries to
Oh,
give this whole essay to explain what,
okay.
and Auden very simply would just be like, well, poetry does nothing, like versus
But
this
he
elaborate.
does he say poetry does nothing or does he say poetry does nothing? It is a mouth.
Well, that's the direct line, but I just mean the idea of like, Bloom's idea of it expanding consciousness is what poetry does. And like, well, the contrast to that, be like, well, does it? I mean, Auden be like, it's just there. It just is, right? All right. Well, we'll
Yeah.
finish the introduction and
Yeah,
then we'll
yeah.
get into this. All right. So Bloom was an American literary critic and Sterling Professor of Humanities at Yale. Uh, he was described, apparently in 2017, as probably the most famous literary critic in the English-speaking world. That's probably very true. And then he had his first book came out in 1959, of which he wrote more than 50 books over his lifetime. 40 of those are criticism. I think he did write one novel, although I've never heard of it or bothered to look at it or read it, although I might be interested now. And then, of course, he edited hundreds of anthologies. I mean, this guy, talk about writing introductions and shit like that to, Penguin Classics. I mean, this guy was the literary critic for decades. That said, his books have been translated into more than 40 languages. And the very controversial thing about him is that, yeah, he is a defender of the Western canon, however arbitrary that shit is to people. Uh, did you just send me something?
Yeah, just in the chat, just keep going.
Uh,
We'll talk
yeah.
about it later.
Education, if people care about this shit. Obviously, he got his PhD at Yale, and then he got his BA at Cornell. at Cambridge as well. He got some, I don't know what the fuck degree he got there. But anyway, that's enough about his personal life. I'm going to X out of this stupid Wikipedia. And that's Bloom. That's what it is. Just a little background. And yeah, I mean, it was this, I like the day he died. God, the guy's so ugly, dude. Like, I just look at these, I look at
Yeah,
these photos. Like, they had like a couple photos of him, like from like the 80s and 90s when like he was making waves. Kind of, I was too young to like be around for the canon wars of like the 80s and 90s that like happened. Some say like kind of repeating that now, but like I
I'm
guess he
sure.
was, that's where he started getting very controversial for people. And then it's so funny to say controversial when we're talking about like books, like, but it's
And we're
just
talking about the area, the part of literature nobody reads.
yeah, but yeah, but they had pictures of him from like the 80s and 90s when he was like more getting very very famous. And God, the guy's just so ugly. The guy's been ugly as shit his whole life. I mean, the guy looks like a the human embodiment of like that owl from like the fucking Tootsie Pop commercial or something.
Yeah. Smart as shit.
Like if you'd see
Fucking
him,
ugly.
yeah, if you saw him talk, he'd be like, "Whoo."
Oh wow, there it is. Young Harold Bloom. God.
See, he
He
wasn't even
just looks annoying.
yeah, like he wasn't even attractive then. Like yeah, like, most people are attractive when they're young. Like he's, and I guess the most important thing about him, you and me, we should mention is the anxiety of influence is probably his biggest. Oh God. So he just sent me the image of young Bloom. Oh,
He looks like he looks like George Costanza wearing a piece.
yeah. That episode where George gets that
I mean,
toupee.
he kinda actually looks a little like Newman.
Yeah, he does. He's Newman. Yeah, dude. He's Newman with a PhD
Yeah.
and very strong opinions about the art. So
That's a good picture. I'll make that my background.
it's so ugly. But yeah, his most famous work, The Anxiety of Influence, and I think that really does influence this. Like this really clearly
Oh,
influenced his entire critical life's work. And I mean, he's definitely on to something with that. But I guess we'll get more into this when we get to these sections.
do you know whether Bloom was like himself a failed poet or did he always just aspire to be a critic?
I
That's
think
something I've wondered but never actually looked at.
I think every critic is a failed writer. I mean, I think Eliot has that famous quote that most editors and critics are failed writers, but then again, so are most writers. Like like
Yep.
typical Eliot fashion. It's funny. I've been looking up more about Eliot recently too. As I had to read his complete works in grad school, but I couldn't really comprehend it that well because we had to do it in like a week.
Of course,
Cool.
yeah.
Yeah, it's like a once a week modern poetry seminar. So we had like 14 weeks of meeting once a week, and so we only could go through like five, six, seven, eight big icons of the period. So it was, and I'm talking complete works. But then it's all right. I got to class and I realized I was the only one that actually read it anyway. So
We only got for Eliot The Wasteland and Other Poems,
yeah,
but I have a complete Eliot. And I think I have a separate like the four quartets.
yeah. We should. I guess we could do a whole episode on Eliot too.
Fuck yeah, we could. I mean,
Yeah.
we would have to talk about um God, what's his famous essay?
I don't know, but as we get into Bloom, I think one of the big things that Eliot, I mean, the one you hear about all the time. It's funny. I was watching Jeopardy with my wife, and it was one of the questions was about measuring your. It was about the quote, measuring your life out in coffee spoons. That fucking line, and it's like, yeah, I mean, it's probably one of the best lines ever fucking written. And speaking of Bloom's theory of elusiveness, I mean, people steal that shit or try to repurpose that type of line all the time. Talk about influence. I mean, Eliot. But all right, dude. Let's. I guess we're. It's the essay itself is divided into like 8 chapters or 8 sections, where he kind of And they do build on one another. So he starts at the one point, and then they build. Each element starts to build, and then culminate in what Bloom would call the art of reading poetry, literally. So where do you want to start?
I think we start up front, right?
Start at the very beginning. A very good place to start. Sound of Music fans know what's up, right? We'll cut that part out. We'll cut out my singing. All right. So what does he say? First fucking sentence. Poetry essentially is figurative language, concentrated so that its form is both expressive and evocative. Whew, where do you
So
want
he
to
keeps
start with
it.
this?
Well, I mean, he breaks it down for us, right? I mean, if we have to talk about his definition of, figurative language or figuration, to keep it sort of short, is a departure from the literal, and the form of a great poem itself can be a trope or turning or figure, which that I got kind of hung up on. I wasn't sure about, but I don't think it matters that much.
Yeah, so what I felt in that first part, especially that first sentence, that first section is essentially I tried to sum up as figurative language versus metaphorical. At least that's what I think he's trying to separate.
Well, I don't think he's trying to separate them. I think that he lists metaphor as part of figuration, right? It's not, but he's saying not all figuration is metaphor, right? It can be so much smaller than that,
Well,
or
that's
it can be more, um, something that you have to sort of attune your eye to see and hear.
right. Well, I mean, he goes on to talk because this is where we get into the figuration. So, if figuration is a departure from the literal, right? So now we're starting to get away from the literal, which is, of course, what everybody kind of obsesses over right now. And the form of a great poem itself can be a trope, or he puts as a turning or figure. And then he gives a common dictionary equivalent for figurative language is metaphorical, but a metaphor is a highly specific figure or turning from the literal. So metaphorical is figurative, yes, but like only one small part of what figurative can be, I think is what he's trying to
Yeah,
separate.
and he like kind of breaks it down, right? He says, so there's metaphor, it's a highly specific figure. He actually doesn't, well, he does. Metaphor metaphor proper transfers the ordinary associations of one word to another. So, I mean, the way you explain it to a room of students is that with a simile, you're saying A is like B, and with a metaphor, you're saying A equals B.
Yeah, man. He uses and Sophie you broke this down in the outline that we're using here. With he's Burke is a huge influence
Yeah.
on Bloom, and I think Fry as well. I think
Yeah,
he's
any of the major critics. He also lists Barfield, Owen Barfield.
Barfield. I think he specifically in interviews, and I haven't done a lot of digging into this, but yeah, he specifically talks about Fry and Burke being his go-to, or at least if he had to call what his biggest influences are, he would say those two guys. Um, I think he mentioned somebody else that was like a big one during the Romantic era, but
Um, he talks about Walter
Sam
Pater
Sam
a lot.
Samson or
Dude, I don't fucking
yeah, I don't
remember.
fuck I
Find
don't
it out.
yeah, it's
We'll
beyond
find out
my
somewhere in my
yeah.
notes.
So, I mean, he breaks down those four tropes, or rather, he uses Burke's breakdown of the four tropes. Do we want to get into that, Soph?
Yeah, I mean, we can just say briefly what they are. I don't think we need to like go too deeply into any single one of them, but just to say like, hey,
Break them down for the listeners, Soph.
there's irony, synecdoche, very confusing spelling. Always had a tough time with that as
That's why I made
a
you do
younger
it.
person.
Yeah, I didn't want to say it.
Metonymy and metaphor. And synecdoche and metonymy are the two that I will always confuse, in which, um, well, so with synecdoche, it's a figurative substitution of a part for the whole, right? So you're saying all hands on deck, but hands are actually referring to people. And metonymy is the one that I always just assume is actually synecdoche, and I would be really in a tough spot if you told me to determine whether one something was one or the other. Metonymy is just like referring to the White House, saying the White House to like refer to the president and their administration, or the crown referring to the king.
Right.
So in both cases, something is standing in for something else. So it feels sort of like metaphor, but whatever. Um, Metaphor proper transfers the ordinary associations of one word to another, i.e., peonies with pony manes, which is from Hart Crane. Bloom uses that. And then there's irony. And irony is actually the first one that Bloom lists. Um, Saying one thing while meaning something else.
I think
So different that it can be its precise opposite.
yeah, it's funny that he uses these breakdown by Burke, but he doesn't really. I mean, I get this is just like, an introductory essay, so it's like a summary of these
I have a
large.
feeling it's really just giving you the terms.
Right.
Not that he's going to use so much in this essay, but in his discussion of the poems that he talks about in his actual, what is it, 100 best poems of the English
Yeah.
language.
And that's the thing too for people to keep in mind is that this isn't like a well like argumentative piece of criticism. This is meant as an introduction to a very large anthology of English poetry, English language poetry. But I think you bring up a good point when we break those four things down, so that all these type of things bleed into one another. So it's very difficult to separate them entirely, which is maybe some of what we like about poetry in that sense, or at least those of us that enjoy poetry.
But I would say, the thing that he says, and this is on page 3, figurations or tropes. So I guess he uses those interchangeably.
Right.
Create meaning, which could not exist without them. And this making of meaning is largest in authentic poetry. So he talks about authentic poetry a lot. So I think to your, just to push back, I would say in some regard this could be seen easily as an argument, because
Well,
he is stating that there's such thing as authentic poetry, and he does sort of go on to argue what that actually is.
yeah. I mean, it is argumentative. I just meant it as like it's a summary of arguments he's been making his entire life
Right.
because he's like an introduction to this and he does get into like
Yeah.
age, feeling like he couldn't have even put this type of thing together unless he was in his 70s and had spent his whole life like reading all these people like. But I wanted to ask you to push back on this a little, that quote you wanted to go a little bit further of that, where it says, yeah, and this making of meaning is largest in authentic poetry, where an excess or overflow emanates from figurative language and brings about a condition of newness. So I said, yeah, what does Bloom mean by authentic poetry?
Yeah, I mean, I think well, at this point, I don't think he's told us what that is. Actually, I think at the very end we actually really get into that. And I don't know, there are actually a couple places where I think he touches on what actually he identifies as authentic poetry. But that really is like I was going to say, sort of, if there was an argument to this essay, that's sort of what it is not just this is how you should read poetry, but this is actually how you should judge it. This is what authentic poetry is.
Well, I think that's what people get upset about too when somebody makes a claim like this. But well, this is authentic. With you're bordering on kind of like the no true Scotsman fallacy, right? Like,
What do you mean?
well, like no true poet would,
Oh,
or
oh,
no true authentic poem Would so that I mean that I mean again, whenever you're making a claim like this and you're backing it up with fierce argumentation, it's
Well, because then, there you're making a statement that I think a lot of people would like to say is not true, which is that there is such thing as bad poetry.
well, I mean there definitely is, yeah.
Um,
But
and
it's
I think
almost
among certain kinds of creative people, well, not certain kinds, but just certain creative people, like especially like because that means there is the possibility of judgment, right? Like you're not
right.
protected from. You can
That's
write a bad poem. It can suck.
right. That too. I mean, I think. Oh man, I hate to keep bringing up Pauline Kael just because I'm reading that book right now, but it's like she goes into this too. How like making a judgment is always going to piss everybody off. Just because not everybody's going to make the same judgment, and I guess that's part of what makes us talking about art so much fun. But when he talks about the condition of newness, like brings the how the poet like authentic poetry brings about a condition of newness. He does go on to explain this a little bit more in detail, but just before we get there, like we don't really know what he means by the condition of newness, but I get this like modernist vibe from it. This idea of
Feels
make
very
it
Elliot.
new. Yeah, 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 yeah. Make it or pound like all these. Well, I guess and even I mean, Sophie and I always we were gonna do an episode on Gertrude Stein eventually, just because Sophie and I are such fans. But it's somebody that was very adamant about like the newness, bring about something unusual. This is unusual. Like, and he goes on a little bit further to like use examples, but the example that he uses to kind of illustrate this authentic poetry, he uses that word ruin. So it's like
Yeah.
Bloom goes on to use the example of the word ruin and its development over time in the English language. Again, this is all kind of only about English poetry, English language poetry, not other, because with Germanic languages we can overlap. So like the Spanish and the French and the ones that have the same type of subject verb agreement, like just the structure of the language is similar. If we get to like something different, like a Slavic language, it gets a little trickier to apply some of these things. But it's like, uh, anyway, yeah, just the listeners keep in mind this only pertains to English language. But like, uh, this development over time. He points to several key developments through Chaucer and Shakespeare. Uh, and does that mean this newness? So is he talking just about word development, or is he talking about something else?
He's talking about etymology and the way that poetry that he believes to be authentic is really conscious of the history of language usage, essentially, right? And I think that's a theme that I think is going to carry through the rest of this essay.
Yeah, he uses the word. It's one of those things where they're using the word. Uh, I get. I guess I just want to push back a little bit on this when he talks about like at the page 5 he says, because he's using Bartfield's another one of his influences in terms of the critics of that period. He's like, I note Barfield's insight that the figurative power of ruin depends upon restoring its original sense of movement, of rushing toward a collapse. One of the secrets of poetic rhetoric in English is to romance the antonym, as it were. To
To renew what Walter Pater called the finer edges of words. Yeah,
right.
romance the etonym. It's a lot harder to say etonym than etymology.
That's why I say, so he references this kind of like the sense of movement that the word has over thousands of years developed to represent. Like he references that, which obviously matters when we're talking about word art. But like, is that what he means by newness? That like this word can be used in a way that isn't hasn't been used before while still representing what it means.
I mean, sure, to some degree, probably, but like, I think he's really, actually, what does he say right before that? I'm curious to know now.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously he's laying the groundwork to get into the section about language here, but when he talks about ruin, he just talks about how a few great poets use it, the word, how it developed from Chaucer, to make its meaning. I mean, this gets into almost how words get their meaning over, thousands of years, or with the internet now, days of usage, and then words just create these, we just accept the meaning of them, and I don't know. So there's that, this
So
idea of
maybe
newness.
you, so yeah, or using words in their original meanings or understanding the ways that they um, can create potentially different meanings
Right.
is
Well, that's what I say. I said if I
sort of
had to,
significant in the process of using language figuratively to build other meaning.
yeah, that's what I would say about it. I would say, yeah, I think if I had to give an answer to that question, well, what does he mean by newness in this context? I would say, yeah, it's the using the original word in a fresh way. And he goes into more detail about this as we get further along. But like I said, I guess he's just laying the groundwork.
Yeah, well, so he says once Barfield sets one searching, the figurative power of, in this case, we're looking at the word ruined, seems endless, right? So once you go looking for where ruined has been used in different ways, it seems that it has different figurative power.
Yeah. And that's where, he was calling, that's what he's calling authentic. And he gets into this when he gets to like the inevitability part of this. So I think it was that like section 4 or 5. So, like I said, each section in this essay builds on what the point he's trying to make. Uh, but yeah, you want to move on to language
But yeah,
through the
but I
image?
think overall, if I were to sort of sum that up, I would say he is starting off by suggesting not only that language is built on figuration, but it's used in combination with an understanding of the history of the language or a tradition in the language.
Yeah, well, that's that too. I mean, it has to. I mean, it has to, or like the words are meaningless on the page. Like there has to be this. But anyway, yeah, let's move into the language section. So,
Yeah, so this one, he goes on to just sort of line out what language is. This is really a continuation of that last point where he's talking about etymology and sort of the historical meanings of words, not just in their current meaning, but where they came from, their origins, all that good stuff. He says language, to a considerable extent, is concealed figuration, ironies and synecdoches, metonymies and metaphors that we recognize only when our awareness increases. I would say our awareness of these things is probably what we mean there.
yeah, I have a question at that point too, because he goes on to say right after that, real poetry is aware of and exploits these ruined tropes. So he
Yep.
set up that example. Though it is both a burden and a resource for later poets in a tradition that language ages into this wealth of figuration. So he does call it a burden and a resource for later poets or writers having a more mature language, as he uses that phrase. And so I was just going to ask you, is that true? And if so, how is it a burden? How is it a resource?
Well, I think it's a burden because, I mean, if I were to go into, what he would be thinking, one, that you are held to certain meanings, right? But also, two, that people can read that word in 8 different ways potentially. And because I would say maybe this most of all, because you are depending upon the way it has been used, you are going to be held to those standards. So if you say something that, you're trying to say something in a new way and um, Harold Bloom might say, fuck you, that doesn't make sense. Look at these 8 examples from Shakespeare and from Hart Crane and from Keats that have these 4 connected meanings. And where the fuck does yours come in on this?
Yeah, and I think this gets to his big, most influential, probably most important contribution to literature, which is the anxiety of influence. So this really gets into his. So of course, the word ruin wouldn't be what it is without Chaucer and all these people using it throughout thousands of years.
So
And it
that we are forced to interpret it in new ways.
Yeah, and then it's a resource, obviously, because now we can go into that reservoir of like thousands of years of usage and just use that single word ruin and all the connotation that's been built on top of it for years, centuries, and we can turn
You're
that.
always carrying that, right?
Yeah,
With
yeah.
every word, you're always carrying thousands of years of interpretation and usage.
And
So,
he goes on to do a different word, so he does the word assume in the second. uh he does it with the word assume in section 2 here, moving on from ruin, where it says he uses the Eliot quote from Prufrock. So the conscience of a blackened street, impatient to assume the world. Again, great fucking little line there, but he uses this idea of assume to make the same example. So he's like, if Eliot's using the word assume in a different or fresh kind of way, while still using this kind of history that has been built up behind it. Uh, my one question, like my one qualm with this, is I'm not sure necessarily that this type of thinking has the explaining power that Bloom gives it or thinks it does. So, like, at a certain point, the history and reduction of a phrase or word can only give us so much insight into the poem, right? Like, there's still a limit as to what it can give us. Or, I don't know. I mean, what do you.
yeah, I mean, I guess there's always going to be a limit to what it can give us, right? And it also depends on how it's being used. So I guess we're going back to, it must be an authentic poem for it to even really matter.
Well, that's what I mean. So, like, if this poem, so either the word ruin or the word assume in the Eliot example, us going back and understanding, even if it's just subtext, us going back and understanding, like, the history of that word and how centuries of use have changed it and shaped it and made it mean all these different things. How much insight does that actually give us to the meaning on the page? Or I guess that's what I'm getting at.
You mean were the people who were making, I kind of zoned out for a second. Are you saying were the mean when people were writing these poems using these words that give us that history, were they all conscious of it?
Well, I mean, I think the answer to that would be no. They weren't conscious. And I think Bloom grants that too when he talks about kind of like the subconscious elusiveness or.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess I'm just pushing back on this idea of like, I'm not sure that this has the explaining power of what is written down in front of me. So like when I'm reading Proofrock, uh, that my idea and the kind of, I would say, reductive history of the word, that occurs to me at all, or that it prevents me, if I didn't understand the larger history, if that prevents me from understanding the poem in some way. And I would argue that I don't think it does, as long as you know about one of the many thousands of meanings that the word could have.
So you're saying you don't necessarily need to be as well read in the history of each, you know, whatever of the language. You just have to be somewhat familiar.
No. I mean, yeah, I mean, I guess that's one, but I think what I'm
I
trying
mean,
to.
it would have to be because like we're only somewhat familiar and we had to read the Odyssey. I
Right.
mean, which I guess is like, one of the first big ones you read. But like we had to read Shakespeare and we had to read like all these other texts that
Yeah, I mean, if you went to high school in America, you had to read Proofrock. I don't know if people actually read it or
Mhm.
not, but or I guess maybe not
Yeah, but
Proofrock. You read The
well, if you're
Wasteland or
reading, yeah, if you're reading the, I mean, well, I guess that does sort of all of these kind of introduce you to the idea to begin with, I guess, because you're forced to look back.
and I
You're
get
forced to go find out who all of the gods are when you read, the Odyssey.
right. Well, they're dependent on that for meaning. So I get that Bloom is making the argument that even if we don't think about it, that we're still, authentic poetry or what he would call good poetry or the best of the best would be using these in, that same way. So like the newness. But then just because they're using it in newness, I don't know if that, like I said, it could mean that they're making good, better art, but does that mean that it's better understood? I guess is what I'm trying to ask.
No, I don't. Wait. So, okay, hold up. Because I need to clarify whether we're talking about this from the perspective of the writer of the poem or the reader of the poem.
Well, I mean, I would, for this purpose, we'll say reader.
So, does the reader have to be. So, state your question
Well,
again.
like, what does that offer them? So, like, we use this word assume, and we, besides telling us that this is like an original use of a familiar term,
I think
does
it
it
can open up
offer
the
us
yeah, I think it can open up the possibility of understanding
new meaning?
the
Is what?
poem
Yeah.
in different ways, or even possibly in some cases getting closer to the intention of the poet, maybe in some cases further away, finding a meaning that was different from the original intention. Well, people I think would say like there's no such thing as that. It should all be intended, and if it's there, the writer should be aware of it, essentially, is that argument as I understand it. And I think to a degree, I think Bloom would agree with that.
Yeah, that would just be my only pushback about like something to use that. But if you want to move on to section 3 or
Yeah, I just, for some reason, the last three words of section two for me were blah, blah, blah. Eliot's irony of images. The poet has a notion of what heaven indeed might assume. Some infinitely gentle blah, blah,
yeah, infinitely gentle.
blah, blah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I just got sick of taking that note, I guess. So, section three, um, Bloom, this is where we start to see a real argument taking shape. He says, he sort of gives us what greatness in poetry means to him. Right? He says, greatness in poetry depends upon splendor of figurative language and on cognitive power, or what Emerson termed meter making argument.
Meter making argument. My first question to that. So, do we agree with that? Is that true? In the most
Um,
basic, we don't have to get super.
at most basic level, I mean, if we agree with him on what figurate, well,
Let's assume we. Yeah, I mean, I guess I, figurative language. I think is just a good way to phrase what we're doing with this like kind of word art like form. But like when he talks about the cognitive power, that's another factor that it kind of hinges on it. So like the if the best or if great poetry or the greatness in poetry depends on like not just the use of figurative language but like the cognitive power. So now we're getting outside the poem here a little bit is my only qualm. But yeah, I just do we agree with that? Should we add or take away anything to that kind of his initial stance? And is the cognitive power what is created from the figurative language?
I think the cognitive power is what's behind the figurative language. Right.
Okay, so it's like overlapped, so it's both ways.
Um, I mean, we can get into what one needs to be a judger and, well, not just a reader, but also a judger of a poem, and whether or not it is what he would call great or maybe just authentic, whether we should be conflating those two, I do not know. Um, the only part I'm like hesitantly stuck on is figurative language. And I want to say yes, because I think he's using it so broadly, and figuration is so broad. Yeah, I'm trying to think of the most sort of plain spoken poem I can think of. All that comes to mind is "It is June, I am tired of being brave," but it is surrounded by figuration, and it comes as sort of a really wonderful and starkly contrasted moment. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think I agree with him.
It's hard to argue with just because it is he's trying to do something that's very difficult, which is to try to make the subjective or the subjective objective. But even then, he's not even there yet. He's talking about just like understanding poetry at this point.
Yeah.
But this is where we get into memory.
Yeah, he says, I mean, I think he said like a lot of good shit in this section. Memory is crucial for all thought, but particularly so for poetic thinking. And then he talks about poetic memory in particular. Um, and he takes from Fletcher, right? Poetic memory, as Fletcher suggests, allows recognition, which he regards as the quote central modality of thinking for literary purposes.
Yeah, I mean, it's the central modality for thinking, period. I agree with that. Like, this kind of like memory is like the basis for almost every thought that a human being can have. And then when he says poetic memory, well, that's, I think he's referring to allowing for recognition on which all literature is based, right? Like, it has to be, right? Like, we can't know what the word ruin means or assume means and, the history behind it without the memory associated with it. So, I mean, yeah, like, there isn't.
Yeah, well, and we should talk about what he means by like poetic or literary memory, right?
Yeah.
Um, he asks a question. Can a poem of authentic strength be composed without remembering a prior poem, whether written by the self or by another? And that's pages 9 to
Yeah.
10
I mean, can it?
somewhere. Probably not. Maybe. Fuck, I don't know.
What's he says? One definition of poetic power is that it so fuses thinking and remembering that we cannot separate the two processes.
Yeah.
I mean, that's an interesting argument. Is that what we get out of poet? And I put here in my notes that I wrote in it. Like, is that the newness he's talking about when he gets this idea of discovery being a synonym for recognition? So, if newness or great poetry takes a memory and gives us new associations with it, I think is the argument he's trying to make, right? So, like, great poetry takes something that we already know and remember to mean one thing or used in one way, and then greatness is when that is used in a way that's new to us. It creates what he would call cognitive power, right? Or cognitive difference, like
I
some
think that's
different,
part of it.
yeah, changes the way we think about this old thing, essentially, in the simplest terms.
But I don't think that's all of it.
Right. Well, that's where it gets tricky, right? I mean, to do this kind of poetic power, like, because we can't separate it. Like, it is
I
hard to
mean, is
separate.
this question really asking, can one, having never read a poem, having never written a prior poem, can you write a good poem? So, can you write a poem, never having read or written one, and have it be a good one?
Yeah, I don't know. That's the question, right? That's can it? Can we?
I don't know if we have an answer to that. I'm sure there's some genius out there, but I also kind of want to say no because then how the fuck do you know what a poem is?
Yeah, I was gonna say, dude, I wouldn't be too sure about geniuses just floating out there that we haven't heard
Yeah,
of. Like,
definitely don't have those.
especially somebody that didn't write. Like, somebody would probably write like a response to this if they did.
Yeah, so I'm gonna say the answer to that one is no.
Yeah, I mean, it would have to be the way he's, and this is, I think, it's hard to argue because he's talking about something that was hard to see, and even when we talked about those four elements that he tries to separate in the very first section, like they still bleed into one another. Like it's so hard to do like a hard and fast line when we're talking about
Yeah,
something like
I have to work
language.
myself up to it though.
Yeah, well, like when we're talking
Some
about
of these
something like
questions.
language, it's not like we're talking about like basic facts or something. Like it's
Yeah.
malleable. Like I mean, you hear that it's almost a cliche now in writing classes and shit. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, can we compose a poem without thinking or remembering a prior poem? Sure. Uh,
One that is good.
but yeah,
One that,
is it
or
going to
one that
be
is, I'm sorry, one that is um of authentic strength.
right? A greatness? Is it going to be great? Is what he says. So the best of is it going to compete with what we would consider,
No,
Shakespeare? Yeah. Can you
100%
right? Can
no.
you
Now that
right?
we phrased it that way,
Right,
told you, man, I'm feeling inadequate.
dude.
That's where I started.
I think this is one of the best serious like attempts to try and get at why people like poetry or why it even exists. I mean,
Literary thinking relies upon literary memory, he says, and the drama of recognition in every writer contains within it a moment of coming to terms with another writer or with an earlier version of the self. Whoo! You want to give that one a go?
fuck no. Fuck
Yeah.
no, dude.
Well, I think the key phrase is the drama of recognition. That to me screams anxiety of influence.
Well, that and it's the recognition, the memory, like all the terms he's using to try and define what it is, what's happening while you're reading a poem and feeling that enlightenment or whatever you want to call it, uh,
Recognition is such a good,
newness. Yeah,
recognition is such a good word to describe the drama of the drama of recognition. Like when you hear yourself saying something exactly like you're trying to be Emily Dickinson, you know? That moment sucks. You're like, fuck.
yeah, but I mean, any writer will tell you that. I mean, that's just part of it. I mean, you have
This
to
is part of it.
you
But
copy.
that's what I think of when, he's talking about this here. Literary thinking relies upon your ability to recognize. Well, I don't know.
Yeah, well,
Can
that's what
be
he says. So discovery coincides with what he would call this idea of like elusiveness, and that's the ALL, elusive with an A.
Yeah, which is really, I think, what the next, I mean, that's sort of where that section ends. Poetic thinking is contextualized by poetic influences, which I think is probably like a good way to sum up what we were just trying to parse out. Like you are the things that you think about when you're thinking about writing a poem are comprised very much, very, very specifically, I would say, of other poets you have read.
Yeah, and when he's talking about elusiveness on page 13, I'm saying at issue is how to determine the appropriateness of an illusion. And since great poetry is very nearly as elusive as it is figurative, the question of accuracy in tracing elusiveness is crucial. So, I was like, elusiveness, so we discovered elusiveness is just references, so kind of like these outside references are what Bloom would call influences in
Of course,
writing.
yeah.
And then the thing I would push back on is it required? Is that required of poet? You know, like, and he's
Well,
saying
I
that's
think it
required
happens
of.
whether you want it to or not. If you read poetry, which hopefully you do if you write it, no offense if you don't, but like
No,
kind of.
take offense if you don't. If you write it and you don't read it, you shouldn't be writing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we agree with that, I think that's kind of true, right? Like, I can't think of a single poem I wrote that wasn't, you know, somehow coming from a place of inspiration from another poet. It's why often before you start writing, you decide to read a few pages of poetry, or why I do. I think also the interesting suggestion here is that you should be an avid reader of poetry and not just like contemporary poetry, but poetry or, not just poetry from one specific time, but poetry through history.
Yeah, I was going to ask that. So let's try to answer the question if he's going to make this argument that elusiveness and the appropriateness of the illusion is a huge factor in determining what's great or not. You know, how does one determine appropriateness of an illusion? And
Well,
does he give us an answer? Or what are your thoughts versus his, etc., etc.?
the appropriateness of
It's a
illusion
weird
is a
phrase, right? I think he's
is
talking
a
about taste,
difficult.
right? He's talking about like taste or how
um
egregious copying. I mean, I don't know. Like, I guess it helps me to think of it as like
what
he's talking
page
about.
does he say that on?
Sorry.
Tell me where to go. I don't have it written
Page
down.
13 is where the quote I put when he's talking about the accuracy and tracing elusiveness. And, I mean, that was just a note I wrote to myself. So, for his definition of great poetry is poetry that combines elusiveness, figurative language, you know, these all the aspects of figurative language that come with it. Uh, and I think that is his obsession with this kind of influence coming in. But is that coming in too far? Uh, and if influence slash illusion, direct illusion, is so important, why is it so important? Does it tell us much more about the meaning of the words on the page or
Well, I
whatever
think
the.
that's the thing it depends on, right? And that's, I guess, what appropriate illusion is. Does it aid in building meaning in a poem?
Right, so that's a craft element, and then
Or is it just there?
I think it's also like a reference to taste, something even more harder to define. I mean, so maybe that's doing a lot of work. Maybe we're just reading into it too much. But I think he does kind of explain that a little bit on page 15, second paragraph or start of the first full paragraph on page 15, where he says recognizing and interpreting allusions depends upon both the reader's learning and her tact.
Right. So I think that's really just talking about accuracy there, right? And it's sort of kindly saying, you have to be, you have to sort of school yourself in the subject before you're able to accurately tackle a lot of elusiveness
It's funny to me
or
that
even pick
people
up on it.
it's funny to me that people get upset about somebody saying something like that. That like yeah, so he's like recognizing and interpreting illusions depends on the
No
reader.
one should
So
get upset at that because,
like
like, look,
the
I don't fucking know what I'm reading. at least 50% of the time, if not more, probably more. Like, and I have to go look up everything, every like phrase or word to find something that it might be referring to.
Well, that too. So it's like it's a less pleasurable experience if you're not as seasoned. But yeah, this idea of like a less seasoned reader, I like that phrasing. Like is going to have a different experience reading The Wasteland than somebody like Bloom in his 70s who's read everything under the sun in multiple languages. Like this guy
Well,
could
isn't
read.
this why people think poetry is too difficult? Because all of its figuration and elusiveness.
Oh shit! Now we're gonna get into it, dude. This I
People,
guess we'll have to have.
isn't that why people shy away from it other
Yeah,
than just straight up not liking it? Like,
I don't know, dude. I guess we're gonna have to have Ben Lerner on to explain, dude. He's gonna tell us why people
why do
hate it.
people hate poetry and
I've
learn?
never read that, but we do plan on reading that eventually, listeners. So if you're interested in
That's
the Hatred of Poetry by Ben Lerner, we're definitely gonna. That's on our list to get into the nitty gritty like this. So. But yeah, I mean,
yeah,
it
we'll also
definitely
get into
affects
some
it.
actual poetry at some point.
But what I'm going to argue here, and this is one of my shticks that listeners will grow familiar with, and Sophie's already very familiar with, where he uses Eliot and the Wasteland as an example for this when he's talking about being a seasoned reader, knowing the illusions that Eliot is putting forth in there. But he's talking specifically about the notes that Eliot included in the original version and how a lot of them were purposefully misleading, careless even. Like Eliot was just fucking with us to an extent, right? I personally hate notes sections in poetry books. Any books, I hate notes sections if you're not doing an academic like bibliography or something like that. Because, and the reason for this, I hate it, is because it takes us outside of the poem. So now to understand what is inside the poem or the work, we now have to go outside of it. It's not all there for us to consume. Uh, and this is kind of one of my bigger problems with some of the modernists, but I do like Eliot and some of those people that kind of fuck with us in this regard. But it does kind of get us to this inside versus outside. So a poem referencing something outside of itself, and like it's how much meaning does that add, right? Or is that still a great poem if it's relying on something that isn't in it? Or I guess you could argue having the illusion, the reference, is putting that in it.
Yeah,
But I don't know. I mean, what do you think, Soph? Because I'm going to be.
I think that is what illusion is, right? It's referring to something outside of itself.
And then I guess that gets to me like, how heavily can a poem rely on an illusion or something outside itself and still be considered great by Bloom's definition or ours? So, like, let's use Bloom's definition, I guess, for this. But so, if his definition of great, how heavily can you rely on something outside the poem or the illusion of it before it's no longer great? Like, is there a limit on that? Like if you have to look up every 5 words or every five, there's like a reference every line to some obscure text, or poets love to talk about Greek mythology because they're all obsessed with it. I don't know. I mean, I guess that was like,
I always just feel like that's a fault of my own, not a fault of the poem. Like, oh, this person's more well read than me, you know?
maybe it is that.
I think that's what it is. I can't fault someone for being so well read that these are the things in their poetic memory or their literary memory that are at work in how they create a poem.
Yeah, the only thing I could fault them for is how heavily it relies on it. So if you're relying totally on this elusiveness to give your poem some strength or some meaning, well then is it still a great poem, right? Like it's
Well, if the illusion is there, it better be relying on it to give you some strength and some meaning. Otherwise, you should cut it.
right.
That's all I gotta say about that.
But then this gets to like what Bloom calls accidental or unconscious illusions.
Yeah. And that's really talking about influence, I think.
Yeah, of course it
Right?
is.
I mean, I can be talking about influence, but I also kind of believe that you can accidentally, like, just without knowing something existed, be alluding to it and then make a poem that doesn't work with that illusion. And then it becomes sort of a shittier poem because it's not working with what it alludes to.
Yeah, Susan Laurie Parks, the playwright, if anybody's familiar, listeners, she's a fantastic playwright. Was taught by James Baldwin back in the day. When I read her red letter plays, so her two Hester plays, I did this in grad school when I was taking a drama class, and it was like they're very much in line with the Scarlet Letter. Like they're very much related to that in terms of this woman that's forced to wear this mark, this red letter, you know. Uh, but when it came out, critics were comparing those plays because I mean, Susan Laurie Parks, a great American playwright. Uh, she claimed that she had never read the Scarlet Letter when she wrote these two plays, and they were two plays that came out of her like at the same time, so they are related in a certain sense, but like they're different plays. And I don't know, it's a fun reference for people that want to look up. Where it's just I'm using that as an example as this idea of unconscious elusiveness, right? So she's didn't even read the story that people are saying she's alluding to, or the novel, the famous novel, the Scarlet Letter that you were supposed to read in high school and didn't read. I've actually never read the book, so I've never read it either. Susan Laurie Parks is in good company, I guess, or I'm in good company with Susan Laurie Parks, and it's I don't know. I mean, so is this unconscious illusion? I don't know. I don't. I. It's so hard to argue for or against it, or I would say it's much easier to argue for it than it is to argue against it.
Yeah, I think so. Well, um, why did I highlight this in red? Illusion is only one strand in the relationship between later and earlier poems, more in my judgment than any other kind of imaginative literature. Poetry brings its own past alive into its present. There is a benign, haunting, and poetic tradition, one that transcends the sorrows of influence. Particularly, the new poets fear that there is little left for her or him to do. In truth, there is everything remaining to be thought and sung, provided an individual voice is attained.
And I know what he's talking about when he's saying unconscious elusiveness. Uh, and on page 16, when he talks about the mode of evasion or warding off a precursor, right? So, like,
Yeah, yeah.
we don't even realize we're doing this. Where,
Well, that's where he's talking about Elliot, and there he's like doing it on purpose, but he also talks about um in the following section where he's specifically just talking about illusion.
right.
Um
Well, before I get to the fifth section, where I got obsessed with this idea of the unconscious illusion, and I just can't understand it. Help me wrap my head around this, where it's like if it's unconscious,
are you alluding to it?
well, that, but also does that heighten meaning or does it cloud meaning? And if it's a reader, so if a reader recognizes an illusion the author was unaware of, does it add meaning to the piece?
I
Like,
think whether you want it to or not, it does.
yeah, I
I
guess,
think it, and I think it's on, I think that is just a hard truth of a possibly failed poem.
right. So if
That
the
even if the
author,
poem is otherwise like beautiful, right? There's this one thing that's holding it back. And it's because the meaning can't fully come together because you have to be just like accept that, yeah, like people are gonna know shit you don't. And you fucking need to do your best to not let that happen, I guess.
and that's what he calls repressed reference.
Well, I mean, when we're talking about is repressed reference unconscious, like in that way where it's
Have to be,
an
right?
unknown, or I don't think so. I think uh where does he call it repressed? On what
Just
page?
the last paragraph, page 16, right before he goes into a larger explanation in section 5 of the illusion, of like what he means by like, what illusion does. Uh, right after he talks about kind of the mode of evasion by like, unconscious influence.
Repressed reference is a defense against over influence. Okay. Yeah. No, it's totally repressed reference here, I think, is what he's about to give us an example of in the next section. I think
Go
repressed
for it, yeah.
reference is just um, like trying to sound like Auden
Ooh.
without, like, I think, well, when you're, doing that, when that's in your head and you're heavily influenced by Auden, right? And everything's coming up Auden that you put down on the page, but maybe you don't mean it to be. And one just like slips out and you don't realize that it's in reference to something that you read earlier.
Right.
In the same way, like, you could say something and swear that, it's something you heard someone else say, but you're not sure where you got that one from. Like, I think you can totally have an unconscious, like, or repressed. I think I would say those two could be synonymous, and unconscious could also mean like unknown, but I think he means more this one. I think he means more that it could be um, a reference that your mind is pulling and you're not aware that it's happening until afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously what he's saying. I guess, yeah, I mean, it has to be because I mean, I remember I was talking to you about this was almost a year ago now, and I was reading Rothke's collected. I kept texting you about it, and I noticed as I would write during my writing times in the mornings, I was writing in meter because fucking Roth, and not just meter,
Oh,
like
well, yeah.
Rothke's stupid nursery rhyme meter. Like I was writing in that just because it was so in my head.
Well, and that's like another thing that's like, one of the, and we'll talk about that after, like memorability, or rememberability, or however you would say it. I don't fucking know how well you're able to, or easily you're able to remember a poem and why that happens. Sound is something that obviously does that. That's essentially what meter exists for, right?
Yeah.
To make you remember, because poems were originally an oral tradition. But um God, but yeah, no, I think like if you're reading a ton of Nick Flynn or like Tony Hoagland or some shit,
Mm-hmm.
right? And Tony Hoagland is, I don't know, working with this something about the wind, and you don't realize it, and you like come up with this thing in your head and you're like, oh, that's a good line, or that's a good metaphor, or that's a good comparison of some kind, or whatever, and it has to do with the wind, and you put that down and it has sort of the same effect, you know as the poem that you read. I think that's the kind of thing we're talking about here. Or you're using this word in this really ultra specific way, or in this ultra specific kind of scene.
Yeah, and Nick Flynn's a much better poet than Hoagland. If I was,
Yeah, that's also right.
yeah, but I do like Hoagland. He was one of my first inspirations getting into poetry. Actually, I'm gonna pee real quick, and we'll get into section 5 here. We'll keep it running for ASMR so people can hear the toilet flush and stuff. But
Gotta hear the toilet flush.
yeah.
I like a healthy stream.
Section 5, where again it's just ever expanding. So this is where he just keeps building on each one, which
Yeah, and well, every section, like, yeah, it does build like that. Um, so that's where he says in the beginning, you know, illusion is only one strand in the relationship between later and earlier poems. More, in my judgment, than any other kind of imaginative literature, poetry brings its own past alive into its present. There is a benign haunting in poetic tradition, one that transcends the sorrows of influence, particularly the new poet's fear that there is little left for him or her to do. He says her or him. Don't want to get that wrong. Puts her first. In truth, there is everything remaining to be thought and sung, provided an individual voice is attained.
I love his optimism with that.
It's optimistic and then it hits you with it. It hits you with that truth.
I remember people saying this in graduate school, dude, and I always had an issue with it to some extent. It's this self fulfilling prophecy. It's this idea when people say, well, everything's been done before. And I'm just like, it's such a depressing idea. Like it's such a non-artist way of thinking. It's such a stupid way of thinking about the art. Like if you think everything's been done before, then what the fuck are you doing here? Like, then what the fuck are you trying to do by being a writer? Like if you think
I get
everything,
it.
yeah.
I totally get it. I get caught up in that too. Well, but I think a lot of people get caught up in that if you just sort of doubt yourself at
Well, I think
all,
that's what it
you
is.
know?
I think it's not only people that say that
Or like
are
in the moment of like great inspiration, I mean, everyone's who reads poems and writes poems has thrown down a book after reading something and says, "Well, fuck, you know, I'll just go fuck myself now. Like,
yeah,
I
of
guess I have
course.
nothing left. This person already did it." And
But
it's
I've
because like you are just so in love with that poem and
yeah,
because it's good. Like,
I've felt
or
that.
maybe it sucks and you like bad poems and that's also like fucking fine. Like what you like. I don't give a shit.
I've felt that. I just hate this claim because I've never actually thought that somebody said this better than me. Maybe that's just my blind like confidence, arrogance, some might
That is.
say, where I'm just like,
It
oh,
is.
I can do this better. Like I can say this better, or he left out this part, or they left out this part, or nobody ever talked about this. I don't know. Like I just think the claim of everything has been done before is such an it's like it's so reductive. It's so reductive, and it dismisses and diminishes like this kind of like,
But you've definitely read shit and thought, fuck, I wish I wrote that.
of
You know,
course,
you can
yeah,
definitely like identify with that to some degree. It's just, yeah, be the overwhelming feeling of everyone said everything and oh my God, I'm just discovering this thing that was written forever ago and how much more has been said since then and they must have covered, it's just like I think it's a very much a young writer
I
way
think
to
it's
feel.
it's a young writer, but also if you're still feeling that when it's a bad writer, it means you have nothing to say. If you're that negative, if you think you have nothing to say, then you'll have nothing to say. So that's what I said. It just diminishes the aspects of like inspiration, and then not just inspiration, but straight up talent. Like I think you just diminishes that by, well, it's all been done before. Like no, it fucking hasn't. That's why we love art that like gives us something we haven't seen
Well, even if it
before.
has, fuck that, even if you do feel that way, like,
Right.
fuck that.
Well, so I mean, I just think I
Just
think
say fuck that.
it's given.
Like, and move on.
I just mean, especially in academic circles like this, I think it's given much more credence than it should. I think nobody's proven that. Like if anything, we've proven otherwise. I guess you could argue like archetypes, the hero saga, like these type of archetypes that we still write stories in and stuff today. But like, doesn't mean it's all been done before just because we have a common archetype that's used. I mean, that's a more craft formula than it is like actually like what you would call like language or like even poetry. Anyway, that's just my whole thing on that. I just like how positive he is about that, where it's just kind of, yeah, for a new poet's fear that there is little left for her or him to do. In truth, there is everything remaining to be thought and sung, provided an individual voice is attained. So yeah, I mean, like I guess that comes down to confidence to some extent, where
Yeah, I'm a
people,
big bitch, so I've thought that
yeah,
100%. I know lots of you other poets out there are big bitches too, you know? So shout out to you.
But all right, yeah, he gets into poetic voice in this after he gives us when he talks about like the illusion and he talks about poetic voice. He gives us those examples of like he gives us just excerpts of 8 poems. So poems that are we don't have a title or author excerpts, and he just like look at the style without any other context, the poetic voice, the elements that make up this person's unique perspective, right? So we hear 9 voices, all piercingly eloquent and all making a difference to our consciousness that really is a difference. Consciousness troubles me here when he's saying that we're making a difference.
Troubles you? It troubles you? Are you
Well,
troubled?
just I hate the word conscience or conscious and unconscious mind. I hate these references when it comes to like literature and talking about literature because they're just so medical and sterile and fucking unproven, unprovable. Like we really like psychologists have a field day with them, but just I guess it was it Freud that brought this into the literature space, or at least the acceptance of Freud as like psychoanalytical analysis in
Well,
literature.
I think the one that with the conscious and unconscious, I think that's more Jung. I think Jung is Carl Jung is I mean, and I like Carl Jung. I think he's good, and
I like Freud. Yeah, I like
I
both of
think a
them.
lot of there's a good world of shit that people work from there in terms of surrealism, for instance.
It just bothers me when literary scholars start using these psychological terms to make a point. So, like, when he's talking about, like, a difference to our consciousness that really is a difference, I guess it gets back to that newness, the idea of recognition and memory, which is, evolved and elusive. Is it starts to get way too hard to prove for me. And I feel like it's a waste of time for literary scholarship to be like spending this kind of like psychoanalysis shit on it. But
Where does consciousness come into it?
page 22, right after he gave us the examples and he's talking about, we hear the 9 voices, that he gave us those 9 examples of different poets to give us their kind of poetic voice examples without context, and you can see the differences. And he says, we hear 9 voices, all piercingly eloquent, and all making a difference to our consciousness that really is a difference.
Yeah, I guess.
And I think that's he means, but when he's saying consciousness, does he mean cognitive power that he was talking about in the earlier
Well, in a
section?
way, I mean, I think he thinks a change in what your brain is doing,
Right.
right?
Yeah, of course.
Um, sort of, if we were to get like ultra technical. I don't know. That I feel like that's the dumbest. It sounds dumb as shit when I say it that way. And maybe it is dumb as shit. I don't know.
Anyway, that's my whole thing. I just think it's
But
so hard to prove when we start going into this realm
but I mean, I think for
of
anyone, to argue for him and what he says here, I think if you are really reading a poem and you really, really read it and it's really good and you're able to build meaning from it as you read it and as you sort of dig in, yeah, that's a change in consciousness.
yeah, I guess I just don't like the word.
I mean, you don't like it being used here because it's not being spoken about in any scientific.
Well, and
Jesus
because
Christ.
I mean there's
Scientific.
it doesn't nail it for him attempting to do something like that. And admittedly it's hard. Like this is very hard to do when he's trying to give us, what makes one poem better than another. All these different factors come into play. So it is hard when he's talking about like, the effect that it has on you makes a huge difference. But I think that's maybe where we get into Pauline Kael's quotes where she's talking about like you know
Well, there
the
There
rules
are,
only matter as long as like we're turned on. So all that matters is you getting turned on by it. You know, did it fucking turn you on? Did you get lit up inside when you read this? You know, is that the consciousness he's talking about? Probably, I would say, right? Like
but even
probably.
if you get lit up when you were reading it, yes, I think that does change what your brain's doing, and that is something that matters. But I don't think it always um, happens because the poem itself is actually good. I think
And
you can totally get lit up by something that just has like one good line or something that really just speaks to you, but maybe isn't going to be a poem that stands the test of time or
right, but is
is
that yeah, is that
actually doing a good job of building meaning as a whole poem.
right? Is that like a good or great thing? It's I was actually it's funny because Kim and I are watching The Crown. My wife and I are watching The Crown, and it's like rewatching actually season 4, the Diana season, and it's like that show is just okay because there are moments of brilliance in that show. I think like there are moments of absolutely just knockout scenes that I still think about and remember, specifically the scene where Diana's hunting with Prince Philip. And it's a fictional scene, like this never happened, you know, like they're making it up about real people, but like so there are moments like that. So there's like 20 minutes of greatness and then the rest is just like a mediocre.
It's
So
boring.
right,
The
so is
longer
that
moments of being bored.
right? So it and those longer moments prevent it from getting up to that greatness tier, like that top tier. And it's I think that's what he's getting at. I think it starts to make more sense when he starts explaining the first example, which is a Shakespeare passage from Claudio. And he said, you know, Shakespeare is there is nothing in his eloquence that reflects his individual consciousness. So he's like, instead, Shakespeare touches the universal with one of what we may call his own voices. Our fear of death scarcely could be more vividly expressed. So I do. It starts to make a little bit more sense when he's saying this universal appeal. So this idea of like the fear of death, this shared aspect, is that the alteration to consciousness or the grabbing from consciousness? Like this the fear of death that everything that's alive
Well,
has.
I think it's the sense of meaning making, right? Like that's really what you're getting at with the universal is that you're able to build meaning from it, or it taps into that, at
Right.
least to some degree, I think.
And it's not like we have a memory of death because we're all still alive, but we have a very real fear.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe I'm just getting too bogged down about this kind of shit.
No, I think I mean, I think that's why poems about the big subjects tend to prevail, right? Like, I mean, that's what we talk about with Emily Dickinson.
Yeah, and he uses the idea of like,
Death and God are two of her big ones.
yeah,
And, that's going to touch a lot of people. That's going to, and it's just like um, tackling the big questions.
and he
It's also
talks.
really hard to write a good poem that tackles the big questions.
Well, the bigger you get with poems, the less meaning you'll get out of it. Usually, that's a good rule of thumb
I don't know if I agree with that.
with
I
big
think the more out of
concepts.
control it can get, I think
Well, that's
the
what I mean.
more
So
out
the
of
bigger
control it
it
can get, but I
is,
think those poems are often, even if it's trying to do a lot, those poems are ambitious.
yeah, if you're good, I think you can pull it off. But in most writers, man, if you're getting very big, because even if you do want to make a comment on something so big and universal as the fear of death, well, then you better get something very specific about it. Uh,
Something original.
yeah, well, that'll not only lead to originality, but it will lead to better understanding, better meaning making if you leave it too. That's my reason I say that, I guess. But when he talks about Stevens, he does reference Stevens being like he is the poet who listens for and somehow renders what lies beyond representation. And then he has the direct quote, the hum of thoughts evaded in the mind. So there are, I mean, and this is what gets to the art of poetry, I think, too, where it's like the things that are evaded even in our own mind. I mean, how do you represent that? I guess he claims Stevens does it well, and I guess he does. I'm not as super familiar with Stevens' entire body of work, just like a poem here or there, but so much for my master's degrees.
Well, is this, give me the page.
Page 25.
Why didn't I write that down?
It's
Oh,
it's
yeah,
just
yeah,
the
yeah.
passing
Okay, it's
thing he
just the very
says.
end.
Yeah.
That's why.
And
Um,
it really, yeah, it's just a passing thing. It's just an interesting, what lies beyond representation. How do we write great
for,
poems
yeah,
about?
who listens for and somehow renders what lies beyond representation, or the what he calls, quote, the hum of thoughts evaded in the mind. Um, yeah, I mean, well, I think that's one of those things of just originality. I think Stevens was a very original poet, and I'm not very well read in Stevens,
Yeah, dude.
but I would identify much of his poetry as difficult.
Stevens.
Um, yeah,
Eh, it's more
no,
I mean, it's more like you can tell he was very influenced by the modernists, but like not quite what they were doing. I mean, it's like yeah, it's much more stripped down and like, but it is playfully ambiguous, which is what I think people say is difficult about it, right? Like it's kind of
yeah,
playfully keeping, and I guess that's why Bloom says it's about the things that can't be really represented. So things beyond representation leads to more ambiguities in the work. But before we move on from like the poetic voice and the illusion in chapters, I mean, we move on to section 6. He kind of hints at style in this section, but he doesn't actually say it or say the word. I guess he's using
yeah.
poetic voice to stand in for like that's a bigger thing, and style's one aspect of poetic voice that he doesn't see fit to mention here. But yeah,
Because
I mean,
style is preference and voice is, I think, more suggestive of a natural thing, right? Like style is something that you can be drawn toward, but voice is the thing that's actually what, the thing that you're actually trying to give body to.
yeah,
Or the voice, I mean, I am hesitant to say like the voice is the poet, but like, because
right.
it's
Well,
not
it's not
necessarily,
separate. Yeah,
but, closer to the poet than just style. Style can change and voice can grow, but voice is voice, right? Like your voice is,
I think they overlap a lot. So I mean, just like everything else we've been talking about, it's very hard to
but your
do
voice is also going to come from just, the way that you think and like
that too. Yeah.
the stuff that your mind does to put shit down on a page. You
And
can,
according to Bloom, that's affected by, what you've read. So what you know about. But yeah, so I guess, yeah, we kind of like style is one thing that we can try and separate, but it's hard to separate because it is like a weird thing.
well, I think he gets to style a bit more without saying it also. But I mean, if we were going to have that conversation, he does sort of talk about it more. He talks about taste, right? Taste matures even as knowledge increases.
Yeah, I
I
mean,
was confused why he said even there.
well, I think one thing he makes very clear, and this isn't just reading a couple things that he's done, especially his larger. If you notice, he didn't put out these large kind of like canonical anthologies that he edited himself and like wrote all the notes on and stuff, like, you know, the Western canon, the best poems of the English language. Like these all came out towards the end of his life, like when he was well into his 60s, 70s. And he openly admits in all of this that he said he wouldn't have felt comfortable making some of these claims if he hadn't spent like the last 50 years, you know, reading these books over and over again, and, you know, making notes and trying to understand them. I think that is one of the things that I think people should value in Bloom. I mean, again, as if they don't. I mean, he's one of the most famous literary critics to ever live.
I
But then
think it's
why?
something I admire in Bloom.
Right, exactly, yeah. And I think Wendler says something similar where she talks about how she was much too young to understand some of Yeats' later work in his when she was in her 20s getting her PhD, and she was reading the poems of, you know, a 65, 70-year-old man. She was like, I couldn't even comprehend them, you know, fully until I was in my 50s, and like
Yeah.
seeing, yeah, like there is that level of maturity that's required to, I don't know, make a claim such as this. I mean, when young people make claims, sometimes they can be wild and fun, and a lot of times they can contribute and be cool. But I mean, to put out like a definitive text to make an argument such as this is like these are the ones, like the best ones.
Well, and it's also like we do it to some degree, I think. I think in favor of just our own, not just our own taste, but it can also be in support of the way that you write.
What when he gets to the what makes a poem better than one another than another, what do you think of the bad versus good poem example, the Poe and the Thoreau?
Oh, I loved it
Yeah.
because as I was reading the poem, I was like, this kind of sucks. I was also
and
like, damn, I bet so many of my poems suck like
and
this.
if you didn't read, if for people that are listening, it's like when you he doesn't tell you which one's which. He doesn't tell you which one's the bad or the good one, and he just like has you read them. But as you read them, it becomes so obvious, which is the point he makes, you know, by giving us these without the author, without like any prompt or saying which one's the good or bad one. He makes
Because
a
you're
good,
able to judge it for
right.
yourself. You're able to test. You're sort of testing yourself.
Jingle Man.
Pose the jingle
The
man.
Jingle Man. Yeah, that's good, dude. I actually, yeah. Sophie sent me a picture of that when she was reading it, like, and I was like, yeah, dude, I already underlined that section with an LOL next to
And how, like, I mean, he really shits on Poe in this section.
it.
He talks about how derivative he is.
Yeah. While
Um,
Poe's litany of I's and my's
so
is
I guess,
pathetic.
yeah. So,
Pathet-
and I mean, you can also, like, I guess this is an instance where maybe illusion, or I don't know if it's even illusion, if that can be a part of something being too derivative, or if it's just too derivative of its own, you know, trying to sound like Byron, being overly influenced, maybe. How can one tell the difference, he says shortly after that? between involuntary echoing and controlled elusiveness.
Ooh,
Only the
control.
cumulative experience of reading poetry could render a reply accessible.
Page 31. Yeah, I have that same thing
30
with
to
this.
31, yeah.
I have that same thing underlined, but I have this controlled elusiveness versus involuntary echoing. And so like what does make the difference? Like what does Bloom say and then what do you think? Like
I mean, I think, well, he says in that, he says only the cumulative experience of reading poetry can render a
right.
reply accessible. So I think you have to, be exposed to a lot of poetry enough to tell that something is, I guess, failing or doing something in an unintentional way.
Yeah, I kind of get a little annoyed again at this controlled elusiveness. Uh this when
Well, he's
he's
getting at intention, right? Was it
right.
this intended or not? And how can you tell the difference?
Well, the only thing is because he uses the his proof of controlled elusiveness and how it's revealed through like revision. So if you look at drafts of earlier versions of the same poem, you can kind of get an idea of where the illusion is coming from or the illusion is coming from and it bothers me some because again it requires the reader to not only read the final draft but go back and read like previous drafts in order to make this type of conclusion.
Well, is he saying then that involuntary echoing is just being derivative of
Yeah.
another writer? Right? I mean, I get sort of. And also to do it unintentionally makes a poem bad. I mean, this is the same argument I guess we were having before. Like it's sort of um on the poet to know that they're doing it,
It,
and you will be judged on that by the well-read, you know, reader of poetry.
yeah, I also put a note here when I was writing that question or does it not even matter, you know?
I mean, are all poems elusive? And if it's not, is it just derivative? Like, I mean, is it either or?
Well, I just think some of the stuff that he says in this section in terms of like controlled elusiveness and like echoing, like I understand that and kind of the writer not being quite aware of it. But when he uses the example of Shelley being influenced by Robinson, or
Vice
sorry, yeah,
versa.
vice versa, Robinson being influenced by Shelley, it's he's claiming these kind of I don't want to call them vague because they're not vague, but they're it borders to me or it falls completely into rather. I mean, speculation. Like, how does Bloom actually know that the dead thoughts in Robinson's are the dead leaves in Shelley's? And it bothers me a little bit because it's kind of like, well, how the fuck do you know this? Like, I get that you could safely assume that there was some influence, but like, can we make that direct of a connection without going completely into the field of speculation? You know, because we again, very hard to prove.
Was he saying that they serve the same purpose in each poem
Right. Well, that's the
in
thing.
the image?
It gets back to the kind of the use of ruin, right? So they're using, he's arguing that Robinson can only use this phrase the way he uses it because Shelley used it in a similar way, you know, before him, which is true to some extent. But I'm just arguing, how conscious is the writer of this? I mean, and does it? And like my whole thing is like, so we know that like Robinson was very influenced by Shelley then, but then it's like, okay, so what does that tell us about the poem at hand? Like, does it really offer that much insight?
Again, I mean, give us some insight to potentially what the poet might value in poetry,
Well, that I think, but the thing
which
is
lends
like,
itself to it might lend itself to a particular reading.
yeah, I mean, it definitely affects the reading. It's just it bothers me just kind of how speculative it is as somebody that takes this seriously. Like how I just and as somebody that tries to write, attempts to write, it's like when people can just speculate endlessly as to where this came from, what it actually means, or what I put that in air quotes, actually, etc. Is that the point of scholarship? And I don't think that's what Bloom's doing here. I think he's trying to do very controlled speculation, very serious speculation. But it's still, I always make this argument in my lit classes, and it would piss everybody off. But like, all we're really doing in all of literary scholarship is speculating, right? Because we don't fucking know. Like,
I mean, yeah, I think, it depends on the poet and what exists of their uh, body of work and, whether they had letters and shit and revisions. I think if those exist, you can sort of easily infer a lot of things. Um, so there's that. But yeah, and then he goes into talking about pride and personal self confidence, sort of.
which matters. I was interested in his idea. He just mentions it and doesn't get super into it. I mean, he talks when he's talking about Whitman being the best American poet in his opinion, except for his one rival, Emily Dickinson, right? And he says what makes them the two best American poets is what he calls this harmonic balance, and this is on page 35, where he talks about this idea of no false notes, which I think, I mean, as each section builds on each other in this essay, I think he is kind of referring back to this, the idea of figurative language and like the great stuff having this kind of natural flow to it.
Well, he's outright saying, like, there's no way I could improve upon this, right? Who could improve even a single phrase of the concluding section of Song of Myself? So, I
Right.
feel like some personal preference is coming in there.
Well, that's impossible to separate. Of course, there's going to be personal preference.
And he does say what makes Whitman the best of all American poets, except for his one rival, Emily Dickinson.
Of course. And I mean, I guess I have to agree with that. I mean, what other American strictly, because the English language stuff bleeds over into like the British and the early Germanic stuff that was happening before English was even a real fucking like what it is now in terms of how we recognize it the last couple hundred years. But that's what he says. So the way he talks about this harmonic balance. So the reason I bring this up anyway is just that there's this where he says there's nothing free about the free verse that we claim Whitman uses, right? In measure and in phrase. It has that quality of the inevitable that is central to great poetry. Inevitable, in this context, takes its primary meaning, phrasing that cannot be avoided, that must be, rather than the secondary meaning of invariable or predictable. So I like this kind
So
of
it
like
has a sense of correctness. This is the correct word to choose here, and no other word could be right.
I think it's a nice way of obviously I think cliches are at the bottom of this, so he's not necessarily talking about things that would fall into the cliche realm. Uh because obviously those are obvious well, god, because obviously those are obvious.
Mhm.
Uh when you see a cliche and you just know because you're already the reason things are cliches is because the association's already been made, right? So you're not creating that newness that he argues in the beginning. But I think it's also like he does try to define it by saying that it is what must be. So like this feeling of like pulling you through the work as you're reading it, which I think is a shared aspect of the greatest stuff I've ever read, even outside of the poetry genre. I mean, all the best stuff I've ever read in my life just pulls you through it. Like it's got this allure. Like Hemingway, I noticed this in Hemingway when I read his complete works, like because that's chronological too. So I got to read from start, like at the beginning of his career towards the end, and then you got to read like posthumous stuff, so like stuff he published or was published after he died, and maybe stuff he never even wanted published. But like even when his stories aren't that good, like meaning they're not that interesting, there's this quality that pulls you through them. And you get to the end of it and you're just like, wasn't that good, but like I just read through this whole fucking thing. Like it forced me through it, kind of thing. And then his language being as simple as it is does help. But I guess to not get bogged down on this, but Poe's Jack in the Box verse, mechanical and repetitive. Yeah, I think that's a good way to describe it, because that's what he's trying to differentiate. The cliche is the easy one to see. But then what's hard to see is this Jack in the Box, this kind of mechanical, predictable, that isn't necessarily cliche, but it's predictable syllable coming after each one. And I think people always talk about this in terms of writing, like they want the unexpected, or put that in air quotes. But I guess that's what he's getting at, where he does try to separate it by being like, this is it. And crucial in trying to determine between the best poems and the imitative ones. And I think imitative is a good word here, like this, right? So on page 39, where he talks about Shakespeare helps illuminate the idea of inevitability as unavoidable wording rather than merely predictable diction.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting way to talk about it. I think it's a really sort of dense way to talk about it.
Well, the idea of imitative really stands out to me, whereas like this imitative versus inevitable in the way that Bloom's claims, like, is so it doesn't even help to clarify it that much. But
Does he say imitative? Is it imitative versus inevitable?
He doesn't phrase those two once against each other, but he does use the phrase imitative versus like where he would say Poe would be more imitative in the example he gives than where he uses the example of Poe. So he says, "Indeed, page 37. Indeed, the difference between those meanings is a pragmatic test for distinguishing between the best poems and merely imitative verses." So
Okay.
then he quotes, "If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles," is unavoidable wording, while Poe's "In there stepped the stately raven of the saintly days of yore" is woefully predictable.
It's really funny to hear someone talk about that poem that way.
Yeah. Jack in the
Yeah.
Box verse, mechanical and repetitive, because it is like he's pointing out a truth that.
Well, I don't know, it makes me think of the idea of breaking form, right? Using form and sort of breaking it in interesting ways. It can often be very boring if form is just perfect. That's a really probably reductive analogy.
Well, I mean, you have to be a little reductive in this sense.
Well, I think in many ways he's not being, and some of that might be achieved through abstraction, but I also think that's kind of okay.
Oh, I gotta get some more water. Hold up.
We're
I put this goddamn. I was pouring the Brita like too fast into my little Nalgene bottle, and it was like blew over
spilled.
yeah, it spilled over
Yeah,
the
I
top. So I
fucking
was like,
hate that.
fuck, and I had to like pick out these
Such
paper
a
towels.
bitch.
And then when I grabbed the paper towel, like it didn't rip cleanly, so I like jerked the whole fucking paper towel holder with me, and it like almost fell into the sink.
Like when the Brita top falls off and you just end up dumping a bunch of water out on your counter.
Wasn't
Fucking
even
hate
that. It
that.
was like it got like the little flap that like let the water pour out of the spout got like hooked or something or stuck with the it's a weird thing here out in the desert. It's like the water is very hard, so you get like hard water stains on everything. Uh,
Ugh.
like yeah, like that. Just we had to get like that CLR shit, like the lime away stuff to like get the hard water marks off of like faucets and like clogging shower heads and stuff. So then we move on to section 7, the inevitability.
Yeah, I found this to be like a weird term. I mean, I enjoyed it.
Go
Um,
on, Seth. Go for it. Say it.
but I mean, we already said it. We talked about it as unavoidable phrasing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's how he defines it here. Inevitability, unavoidable phrasing seems to me then a crucial attribute of great poetry. And then he says, but how can a reader tell for herself whether a poem she has never seen before possesses the quality of authentic poetry?
Right.
So is he conflating authentic with great here? It doesn't matter. Do we care? I don't know that I care.
Well, I think authentic is like one thing that a great poem has to have, but I think a mediocre poem could have it too.
Yeah, you're right. I don't think it's deeply important for this purpose.
But these are the questions, yeah. So he points out these kind of three
Yeah.
questions to ask yourself in determining this kind of. He doesn't call. Oh, he does call it close reading eventually, but he uses the Hart Crane poems example. We said the three questions you should ask. So, like, what does it mean, and how is that meaning attained? Can I judge how good it is? And then finally, has it transcended the history of its own time and the events of the poet's life, or is it now only a period piece? Uh, so those are the
It's a
three
great
questions.
criteria.
It is. I did question when I first read this is how useful some of those were.
Can
Uh,
I judge how good it is?
yeah.
Made me laugh. But only because I was like, yeah, I don't know that I can.
I mean, you can, but
I
like,
mean, you can't, but like
is it
when
informed?
when you're
Or yeah,
asking that question, is he just saying, do I have the skill to judge how good it is? Do I have the learning to judge how good this is?
I think
Is
it's
that what
also
he's
like,
saying?
I think it's more so. Does your opinion fucking matter? Because I mean, there are plenty of people that say Shakespeare sucks online all the time, and I'm just thinking like, you're not qualified to make that. Like, you either
Yeah.
haven't read it or you just don't understand what you're saying. Like,
Or you don't like to read.
well, which would, I mean,
Yeah.
both, like all of that. But the last one I think is, has it transcended the history of its own time and the events of the poet's life, or is it new, or is it now a period piece? Um, that's a tough one to answer. Again, I don't know. I think that is. I don't know how useful it would be. Let's say if we're, well, I guess it's one thing you can't even determine unless it's an older piece. So it's,
Well, but the only way it can be useful if you're reading a contemporary poem or a poem that has been recently written, um, is to take into consideration how much you're reading into the poem just because.
well, I mean, if you, it depends how much you want to. He uses Crane as the main example here. I guess just because he loves Crane. But we talked about those three questions, how useful those can be. Uh, he does do like a close reading of Crane to give an example of like those three questions in use, right? And it's a very, very close reading. I mean, it's fucking Harold Bloom doing a close reading.
Yeah, it's good. You should read it. I mean, it's good. I'm not gonna like go over it because it's like dense and it's a lot.
Yeah, it's
And I don't
Latin.
think
It
uh
references specific. I actually have a huge chunk like underlined and like blocked off because I was going to ask you about like the associations that Bloom makes with the poem and if you buy them or not, but if I think we might get too bogged down in the actual heart, we would have to like read the Heart Crane poem to like the audience and then start,
Um,
and I don't think we should do
I
that.
don't think it matters whether I believe them or not, in all honesty. Like, I do believe them because Bloom is easily able to make those associations, and that's fine for him. I would not be, and if I could, when I was reading Heart Crane, I would feel adequate to make such judgments.
Yeah, and he does at the end of the close reading, he does get into the kind of like he's attempting to add clarity to a very cloudy thing. So he talks about the literalizing of the image, right? So, and he talks about how the literalizing of the image really can hurt the interpretation. So that like possibilities for multiple interpretations. He's talking about the boat voyage in the Crane poem that he just spent, pages
Yeah.
close reading. So it ends with this kind of boat voyage, and he's talking about like how so many possibilities can exist in a single image of the boat voyage. Uh, so a boat on the sea, like Bloom mentions, like I guess my question is, how do we know if there's so many possibilities? How do we know which one is the correct one? Or so when somebody's interpreting an image in a poem or a work of art.
What page are you looking at?
uh I got this on page 48, but he's talking, he says, though we must not literalize this superbly organized procession of images,
Okay.
both visualizations are possible. The boat voyage, of course, likelier. But if we wanted to be more literal with the actual words on the page, again, kind of, so we could, I guess that's his argument, is we have to pay attention to the figurative language and not the just take it literally, because that's part of the art of poetry.
Yeah. I mean, I think literalizing, I mean, you can certainly literalize it, but that's not going to give you a whole meaning, right? I think that's true of pretty much anything.
Well, and it would even cloud the meaning if you're taking it too literal and the poem wants you or intended you not to, especially something dense like a
Yeah, and we've
Crane
seen that
poem.
happen in
Yeah.
workshops all the time,
Oh
where someone
God.
uses a word that's just a little bit like too clinical, you know?
Yeah, I mean, Bloom grants, I think that's one thing that makes him a great serious scholar, is that he grants that this is extremely difficult. There's subjective aspects to this that are hard to parse, but he does try to offer like a clear vision of what he's saying, like, which is helpful. So he tries to give clear definitions of these terms, how he's using them. But it may still fall short. I think he grants that too, that like it may, despite all his trying to define what it is that makes a poem great, like it may still fall short. I mean, like because it is intangible to some extent, but it's not. So that's what makes it difficult. It's both.
Which is how he begins part 8. Hart Crane is a difficult, great poet, but very good. That's a funny but.
Yeah, and that's I wrote down in that the reader difficulty or reader literacy versus cognitive originality. So yeah, he said difficulty in great poetry can be of several very different kinds.
Just cut that shit
Yeah,
out.
we'll cut that part out. But he said difficulty in great poetry can be of several very different kinds. Sustained elusiveness, as in the learned poetry of John Milton and Thomas Gray, demands a very high level of reader's literacy. Cognitive originality, the particular mark of Shakespeare and of Emily Dickinson, requires enormous intellectual agility as the reader's share. So when he talks about like, and that's why I put this kind of like reader's literacy versus cognitive originality. So like,
Yeah.
how do you think he defines those? I mean, he gives examples.
Well, I think reader's literacy is how well read are you and how able are you to identify and recognize
The sustained illusion. Yeah.
figuration and illusion,
Yeah.
um, and small, um, well, I guess what he calls a heightened awareness of the nuances of figuration. I think the reader's literacy has to match the writer's. Cognitive originality, I think, demands sort of the same thing, but also clearly intellect.
So then it it leads me to this. Yeah. So does difficulty stem from the reader's point of view only,
I don't think so. I don't know that the writer knows that they're being difficult as they're
or
writing necessarily.
or I guess so then does difficulty just ask more of the reader?
Yes,
Yeah.
100% difficulty asks more of the reader.
Right. So
But,
and then
difficulty doesn't mean good,
right.
and good doesn't mean difficult.
Yeah. Which again, this is why it's so hard to talk about this stuff seriously. I mean, not to mention people that are just gonna like,
Well, and even us, we're gonna, like we read poems, maybe more than most other people we know, not more necessarily, definitely not more than most poets, I would assume.
which is true for any, I mean, any field, any profession. Like nobody can know everything. There's always going to be gaps. Like it's impossible to know the entire canon, although we can try. I mean, maybe that's the beauty of it. Right now, I'm thinking of
Yeah,
Once
and
Upon a Time in
some poets are
Hollywood.
just smarter than you. Like,
Yeah,
that's also a reality.
yeah. I think that. Do you think that was Bloom's problem?
Do I think he was smarter than the people trying to, take him down? I don't really. Well, like, also at that point, he's too ingrained in literary memory,
Yeah. I mean,
I
yeah,
think, for it to be of great consequence.
yeah.
And I think in his writing, he's much too likable.
He is
Um,
charming. And when I hear him speak, like when he died, I did do like a deep dive for a couple weeks on YouTube. Watching some of his interviews, some of his lectures, and I mean, the guy just loves art, man. The guy just loves literature. Like he fucking loves it. But anyway, finish this up on page 55. He's talking about great poetry. So he says, I think that, and this is page 54 to 55, I think that poetry at its greatest in Dante, Shakespeare, Donne, Milton, Blake has one broad and essential difficulty. It is the true mode for expanding our consciousness. There's that fucking word again, Sophie. Like,
I know.
yeah.
I'm really scared this is gonna launch into like way too long a thing just because you're bitching about that word.
And they said, this it accomplishes by what I have learned to call strangeness.
Yeah, and we go back to Owen Barfield.
Right. Well, and again, he defines strangeness as it gets back to this idea of memory and associating images with unusual or new things. So the strangeness is what helps to create an old memory and make it what he would call newness.
And but it's also, he also refers to, it must be, well, what Barfield says, um, it must be a strangeness of meaning. So newness of meaning, not just of like the image or the combination of words, but, well, I guess combination of words does sometimes lends itself to a new meaning, but strangeness of meaning.
Yeah, and the big Barfield quote. So, yeah, this idea of creating strangeness, but like the Barfield quote, strangeness in fact arouses wonder when we do not understand. Aesthetic imagination when we do.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a good way to talk about it, right?
I mean, yeah, but I mean, I guess we should talk about what that, what
It's
the
so broad. I mean,
saying. Yeah,
it's
it's vague. It's
so,
almost like consciousness. It's
yeah, but
expanded my
it's
consciousness, bruh.
because, I mean, it's sort of abstract, and it's trying to nail down something that's really hard to nail down.
Yeah,
And that I think even he admits is hard to nail down. But he goes on to say that consciousness is the central term here,
Yeah.
right? So something,
He offers a little clarity into
it
consciousness.
arises from contact with a different kind of consciousness from our own. And this is still from Barfield.
Right. Which
Different
creates
yet
the
not so remote
strangeness.
that we
Yeah.
cannot partly share it. I had a hard time parsing this. I was
Now,
also reading it in a quick on the like in a
dude,
haste on the toilet. So
I was doing the similar thing. I mean, it took me 2 days to read this little 50 page, very short uh, essay, just because I did right around this section 6. I had to really slow down and break down all the quotes, all the close readings, and things like that. He does try to get consciousness. This is one of the things I like about Bloom is that he's going to use a word like consciousness, but he's not going to do that without trying to give us a little bit more depth, a little bit more clarity about that. So he's like consciousness, and this on page 56. Consciousness is the central term here, as Barfield intimates. Consciousness is to poetry what marble is to sculpture, the material that is being worked.
yeah.
So, and yeah, and he calls words are figurations of consciousness, metaphorical of consciousness. The poet's words invite us to share in a strangeness. And then Barfield's last quote that he puts in here is that a felt change in consciousness is what he would call the poetic effect, or this strangeness that's like initiated in the reader. And I like that idea better, like this idea of it just, I think it's just more direct, more concise, and this kind of a
Well,
felt change in
it,
consciousness or the way you're thinking or feeling.
it's Dickinson's, feeling as though the top of her head has been taken off,
Felt
right?
a cleaving in my mind.
That's what I mean. I think that, or that's how I'm reading it. Um,
Yeah, of course,
I
but
agree. And I think, I like that he is actually trying to define something that's hard to nail down
of
without,
course,
he's giving it terms without getting, I, and you would, I think, maybe argue with this, but without getting overly clinical.
yeah,
And he says, the two things that I really pulled from this part were that quote, consciousness is the material being worked, which I think is sort of what he's been loosely saying through this whole thing and by other means. And the last thing he says, well, yeah, essentially the last thing he says is um, to possess it by memory, and this is of great poetry, he's saying, to possess it by memory is a start, and to augment our consciousness is the goal. The art of reading poetry is an authentic training in the augmentation of consciousness.
yeah. That's the thing too. So I was gonna ask you. So is the work? Do we agree with that? Is the work of great poetry to aid us to become free artists of ourselves, and like expanding this consciousness when he refers to
Oh,
Hegel?
dude, we would have to get into that whole free artists of ourselves quote.
Well, I think the other option, and this is why I brought up Auden at the beginning, dude, is like because I think we may also just be assigning something to poetry that maybe we just were making up. So like and I mean this gets difficult to parse because we romanticize art a lot in our.
We're also fairly young poets.
Well, I just mean culturally, like we romanticize art a lot, and I worry about us pretending that art can do more than it actually does.
Yeah, and I think, we've talked about that and I agree with it, but
Whereas like Auden would argue that like, well, poetry doesn't necessarily have to do anything. I mean, why does it have to expand consciousness? You know?
why? Well, I'm not sure that I would necessarily agree that Auden is excluding that as a possibility, but I do hesitate at times to think that poets have such precise or I don't know what the word is that I'm looking for, but I don't know that that is what I would ascribe to. I think poets are more selfish than we're giving them credit for here.
Right. Oh, that's part of what I get at too. So like, does it even have a goal? You know?
Well, if the goal is to expand one's consciousness, I mean, who's if not the poets? And then, I mean, any way you say it to me, it's kind of like a little bit self-involved,
Of
right?
course.
Or
Yeah.
a little bit selfish.
Yeah.
Or, because either it's the poetry is an act of generosity argument, which I also don't like. I understand what that means is that you want people to be able to understand it, and thinking about generosity in terms of meaning making. It also feels self-involved to presume that this thing I'm writing is it's generous of me to do this. And I also think to say that, you do it only for you or to expand your own consciousness is also like kind of selfish, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing like greatly noble and like I'm trying to better myself.
Well, that's what I mean. I almost feel like, are we putting like, I don't know. I mean, it's just this. I mean, it's a poetry, so we could argue that doesn't matter at all. I mean, but if we're gonna say what the purpose of the art form is, maybe it's too easy to say it has no goal because that's not entirely true. Even if you pretend it.
Is it Sir Philip Sidney? Um, Poetry should delight and instruct. I don't know about the instruction part, but
Yeah.
I actually think expand consciousness is or felt change in consciousness is a much better way, I think, to say it than the intention of instruction.
Yeah, and then my last question before to wrap it up before we get into I do want to talk about this Pauline Kael quote to maybe say that maybe everything we just talked about the last couple hours is worthless and we shouldn't even bother. But yeah, I mean, what would in our own words here? What is the art of reading poetry? Like, is it just a snobby way to keep poetry elite? Like, I think that's what somebody would argue about Bloom's interpretation if they didn't buy it, or
I think the art of reading poetry is much like the art of writing it. It's engaging with a tradition, whether you like it or not.
okay,
You're forced to.
engaging with tradition.
I think anyone who proclaims to be ignoring tradition in any way is full of bullshit. And I've heard this in visual art, and I've heard this in,
It's a very,
um,
very late, like mid to late 20th century thing to say. I think, like
yeah,
in most art fields. Yeah,
fuck tradition.
yeah,
Well, it's like, okay, but even then, if you're saying
yeah.
fuck tradition, which every generation has for as long as humans have existed, right?
Oh yeah,
And have been making things or like having any kinds of routine. Fuck tradition. Like, you're still then responding to it,
yeah.
right? Even whenever we say something that is post something, post confessional or post modern, it's in response to.
And it is funny to me that this is like this.
You can't engage with poetry in any true way without engaging with the tradition of poetry.
Well, it's also like every time you buy like a book or you read an essay about like the art of poetry or what it's supposed to do, or something, or somebody has a theory or an idea on it, it is this like,
Or why you shouldn't be scared of it or why people hate it.
yeah, but it's also just like, well, you should learn this stuff before you do this. Like, it's like, I don't know.
Or you should learn this stuff while you do it. You should read.
Yeah. But this is also like the art of close reading kind of thing
Yeah.
that he's talking about, because these principles can be applied to all the texts, almost any art. I mean, not the same way. I mean, he's talking specifically written English word, like English language written too, because again, once we switch languages, shit gets changes a little bit here in interpretation.
Oh,
But
yeah.
before we finish this up, dude, just that Kale quote, just to give an argument about how everything we just talked about could possibly be
Yeah,
bullshit.
what's her name? Darlene? Doreen Kale?
Pauline,
Pauline? No, I was kind of close, dude.
yeah,
I was surprised.
she says this in her essay from 1967. It's called "A Sense of Disproportion." She reviews about 4 movies in it. But the very first sentence, dude, like this full first sentence is, there are not, and there never were, any formal principles that can be used to judge movies by that can be used to judge movies, but there are concepts that are serviceable for a while and so pass for, or are mistaken for, objective rules until it becomes obvious that the new work that we respond to violates them. Now she's talking about movies specifically, but I lean more towards that idea that like Bloom is trying to do something that is serviceable. Maybe not like the tell all end all of the objective way to evaluate a poem, but he's trying to create like serviceable things that we either can pretend or confuse for, as Pauline would say, objective uh, analysis. But is it really? Can we ever really do that? Like, I don't know.
Well, I guess if we believe that there's such thing as good and bad in terms of quality of a piece of art, then there has to be something, right?
Yeah,
Something can be objectively bad. And yeah, but I do think Bloom is trying to at least give voice to what he would deem to be those qualities that are not just good, but I think one of the things that is really important to Bloom in poetry is, um, will it stand the test of time?
yeah,
And like, will it be its memory? Will it be remembered down the road, like in 100 years when people are reading anthologies from that include the year
right.
2021?
And
Which ones will be in it?
people do make that claim, like history, or as things develop, it's kind of its own self-corrective. So like, even if there was like an obscure critic that got panned like during their lifetime, like 100 years later, like people start to recognize, oh well, they actually had a contribution, like they actually had something to say here that like people talked shit about while they were alive, but now 100 years later we have enough knowledge collectively to be like, okay, there was something here. And maybe that's, I mean, as if I don't want to give the impression that like Bloom is like some like ostracized, because he's not. I mean,
No.
he was a towering figure. I mean, if not, yeah, the biggest.
I mean, his last book that he wrote, or at least the last one that came out before he died, Possessed by Memory.
Right.
It's very autobiographical.
That too. So yeah, listeners,
Uh,
when you see this, like, it's almost crazy. Like every book that he goes to, like the 50 that he wrote in his lifetime, like, are just, this is like the art of reading poetry is almost like a summary of all of those books, like wrapped into like a little 40-page essay. Like it's all his theories, whereas we're like, oh, he doesn't expand on this enough. If you're interested, like, read some of the books where he does expand on all these little summaries he gave us in this essay, because he does.
yeah, and I mean, he basically in his in his most autobiographical, I think his probably his most autobiographical work, he's still like giving us readings of texts that he's really been reading since childhood.
Right.
Um, which I think would be another interesting read down the line.
Fun fact: he was also Paglia's thesis advisor during her time at Yale.
Damn.
Yeah.
Wow.
So yeah,
But
he
yeah,
helped
he
craft sexual personae for people that are interested. Talk about the anxiety of influence, huh?
oh my God.
And I mean, that's just one of the people that he probably helped, dude. Like, I don't even know all his students that were at Yale.
He does state in Possessed by Memory that for me, poetry and spirituality fuse as a single entity. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if poetry was a big part of his spirituality also.
Yeah, I mean, you could. I mean, we could
He's
talk
also
about.
really Jewish. He's really Jewish.
I mean, I was just. We could talk about Milton. We could talk about all these people that were doing like the
I think
very.
he's really Jewish, right?
I don't know.
Well, we'll cut that out anyway. It doesn't matter. But I'm pretty sure.
Probably.
Well, shit, man.
Is that it? Nothing else on Bloom or the art.
Read. Read more and better.
Yeah. What are we doing next week? Or next episode?
I think we're going to talk about the remains of the day.
Right, so
Ishiguro.
Yeah. Next episode, we're going to do Ishiguro, the remains of the day. So pick up a copy. Again, we'll link the copies to this. We'll link to the copies of the Art of Reading Poetry, and we're going to link to his big tome. So the best poems of the English language, if you want to buy whichever version or both, if you want to. Honestly, the better value is probably buying the big tome, but...
Okay, he was raised as an Orthodox Jew in a Yiddish-speaking household, according to Wikipedia, so I didn't make that shit up, all right?
Dude, you just knew. It was in your...
No, I mean, I read some of Possessed by Memory, so I'm pretty sure I was like, well, he's like he knows the Torah, so
Yeah.
like, but you don't have to like be a Jew to know the Torah, so I just I thought I made an assumption. I wanted to will it to be true.
I don't know if that's...
He learned English at the age of 6.
Damn.
Damn.
No wonder he
Wikipedia
associates...
dropped shit.
No wonder he associates reading with spirituality. That's what I think a lot of people do that in lit scholarship. It's almost this spiritual religious worship of
Education
the word.
is also like a really big thing in Judaism.
Well, there it is. There it is. All right,
There it
yeah.
is.
Next episode
The
we're
ugly
doing...
Harold Bloom.
No, yeah, he's so fucking ugly, dude. He's so ugly. Oh,
So smart.
yeah. God.
So ugly.
All right. Next week or next episode, we're doing Ishiguro's The Remains of the Day. Pretty fucking famous book. Anybody wants to do that? So it's a must-read novel. I've actually never read it, so
It's contemporary, though,
yeah,
so.
we should have a good time with it. If you want to contact us at theheavyboardpodcast@gmail.com. Subscribe to our Patreon so you receive full, uncensored, and exclusive content and episodes for subscribers. Check out our YouTube channels for partial episodes, clips, etc. if you're cheap. Links to all the books and shit in the description. And again, next episode we're doing Ishiguro's The Remains of the Day. So this has been Heavy Board. My name is Andrew Whitstadt.
I'm Sophie Weiner, and I still feel inadequate.
And I guess we'll see you guys. Maybe we won't.
Yeah, peace, dudes.
We'll expand your consciousness.
Heavy.
Bored.
Heavy.
I am heavy bored.
I may say that the male is entirely hostile. No! Inner
Resources.
life, friends, is boring. We must not say so.
such a lack
Heavy.
of gratitude for life. Bored. I aspire to boredom, I
Heavy.
should say.
Bored. Heavy.
I am heavy.
Bored.
Has you the night sweats and the day sweats, pal? Pal, I do.